Hello, my name is Robbie Morrison. I am the PLM product manager who is responsible for Creo View and visualization in Windchill and Navigate. For today's expert session, we'll be focusing on the Navigate 3D Viewer. Today's presentation is one of our larger series of expert sessions that are designed to bring users of our PLM, IoT, and AR products up to speed as quickly as possible. These sessions will cover a large set of topics, including design, development, deployment, maintenance, and tips, as well as new capabilities of our software that might benefit you. If you have any questions during the presentation, you're more than welcome to type them in our Q&A box. We'll be reviewing them live at the end of the presentation today. If there are any questions that can't be answered live, we'll share answers later along with the session recording. And with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. Today, I'll be focusing on three main areas. To begin with, I'll be doing an overview of the Navigate 3D Viewer, otherwise called the ThingView widget. I'll also be going over a brief tutorial or a brief intro into building mashups with this ThingView 3D widget. And last, I'll highlight a couple new features inside of the latest ThingWorx 9 release. With that, we'll go ahead and get started, beginning with the overview. To begin with, the ThingView 3D Viewer is available in the out-of-the-box part structure app. You may recognize it in the bottom left corner that allows you to view the 3D representation of the parts when searching on them for them using Navigate. You'll notice that we've recently in ThingWorx 8.5 added some new UI controls to help users interact with these 3D representations. On the left-hand side, we have the View panel, which is responsible for activating and controlling the view. And on the right-hand side, we have the Model Control panel to give users more capabilities to interact with the model. Both of these panels will expand and collapse to get in and out of the user's way as they need to interact with the model. In the View panel, we have capabilities that are focused really on activating preset views for the model or figure that's being displayed to the user. This includes a series of standard orientations, as well as the default view that you might first see when you're opening the 3D content, and then pre-authored views like view states, which might have been defined in CAD, or figures which would have been defined in an illustration. View states or figures will be available based on the type of data loaded. Creo View data will may have view states if it came from CAD designs, as Creo Illustrate data will primarily have figures that were authored by an illustrator. The Model Control panel on the right-hand side really focuses around manipulating the model. This includes most of your simple commands for interacting with 3D content, things like hide or show, zooming to certain areas or zooming to window areas. Also, we've enabled the ability to translate parts in order to pull them apart and understand how they're assembled. The menu here will allow for vertical scrolling when you have a limited space available. With that, let's take a quick look at how that looks like. I've got here a very simple mashup that I've built, which really just focuses around the 3D viewer and what it's capable of doing. This is going to be the same exact view that you would see inside the part structure app inside of Navigate. We can see here I can simply rotate the model. I can zoom in and out on areas of interest. But I've also got these two simple menus that allow me to help interact with the model. Let's begin on the right-hand side with the model control. We've got a series of buttons that are dedicated to hiding and showing. We can hide selected objects. We can also isolate and only view a particular object that's been selected. And then we can show all of the content back again. We also have the ability to have a series of zoom-related actions. Here we can see that we can zoom all, which will center everything back in the screen again. We can also zoom on a selected component, which will make that component take up the full size of the screen. We can also zoom into a window area, which allows me to draw a particular area I'm interested in and make that full size into the screen. The last set of capabilities that we have is to enable users in order to really pull apart and better understand exactly what they're looking at. In this case, I can activate my part translation mode, and then I can select the components and drag them out of the way. The user will be presented with a gnomon that they can interact with. They can either drag it in a particular plane by selecting the plane of interest. They can drag it along an axis by selecting any of the individual axes that are of interest, or they can rotate along a particular plane. Once they're done, they can continue selecting as many components as they'd like and go ahead and pick them apart so that way they can see maybe there's a component that was obscured and they want to move things out of the way in order to view it. Once they're done, they can restore all of the original part locations back to the way they were when they opened it. And now that I'm done, I'll go ahead and disable the part translation mode. So that concludes a very brief orientation to the model controls. Let's take a look at the view controls. The view control panel can show a couple of things. It will show the default orientations that are the standard 8 orientations that you'll typically see. Your ISO 1, ISO 2, and then each face of the sun, each of your standard faces. Top, bottom, left, right, front, back. So these are going to be your standard orientation. In addition to that, there's likely some views that you might be interested in. In this case, we have our default view, which will always get us back to how we started to load the model. But we also have some combined states that were authored in CAD. Here, I can activate those states and view those annotations. And if I'd like to get back to the original state, I can simply click the default view. All right, so in addition to the model and view controls, we've also added an extra control panel whenever you're viewing animations or sequences. This will enable users in order to play, pause, and skip any sequence details or animation controls. For animations, as you can imagine, we simply have a play button, a reset animation, and the ability to drag the animation state. In addition to being able to play the animation, you can also move the playback controls along the bottom side of the screen. This will allow you to get the playback controls out of the way of the animation if it's being obscured. Similar to our animation controls, our sequence controls simply have 2 extra actions. They have the play all steps action, which allows you to play each step in sequence, and then they have the ability to go to previous and next steps in the sequence. In addition, they also display the step number to the right of the draggable animation slider. So let's take a quick look at how that looks like. So I have here a simple mashup that's been built to highlight these capabilities. Here, rather than loading CAD data, I'm loading an illustration that's been authored using Creo Illustrate. Whenever an illustration is authored, and there is more than one figure present, the user must select which figure they would like to view before it gets activated in the view. In this case, we're interested in the animation and sequence figures. I'll go ahead and activate the animation figure. When a figure is activated that has an animation, we'll see that the animation controls become available. Here, the user can select play to play the animation. They can grab the slider and drag the animation to an area of interest. And they can also choose to reset the animation. back to the beginning. If they feel that their view is being obscured, they can simply drag the animation controls off to an area that is less intrusive. Let's take a look at what sequences look like. I'll activate the sequence, the figure named sequence, and then I'll go ahead and hide the view panel. Now we can see here that the step name is displayed in the top left corner. Similar to the animation controls, the slider is displayed in the same location, but now we have a couple extra actions. I still have my play button, which will play the single step that's active. Once a step has been played, you have the ability to either advance to the next step or the previous step. In addition, you have the ability to play all remaining steps. Here it will go through steps 2 and 3 sequentially. Great. So that concludes our brief overview of the Navigate 3D viewer called ThingView. So now let's go over how to utilize ThingView in custom mashups. Beginning with ThingWorx 8.5, we've opened up the ThingView widget that comes along with Navigate for use in custom mashups. In this section, I'll go over and provide a quick start view of the important things to consider when building a mashup, including the ThingView widget. This will include how to load and access CreoView data, key settings and properties that you might need to be interested in, and key data tables that you need to be aware of when trying to interact with data. The first and most important thing when building a mashup is understanding how to get data into the 3D viewer. The property labeled Product to View is the key property to define what data you will be viewing inside the 3D viewer. By changing this, you will set what will be loaded into the 3D viewer. This field should be populated with a URL to the content that you would like to load. Keep in mind this needs to be a URL where the user viewing the mashup is able to retrieve that data from. Now, ThingView is a native browser 3D viewer. It is not like the CreoView plugin that has typically been inside of the Windchill applications in the past or early on in ThingWorx applications. That means that all requests to load content must abide by standard security practices for cross-site origin requests. Unlike the CreoView plugin, which you could route requests and tell it to go and retrieve data from Windchill, those requests would be a separate process that was separate from the browser and thus looked like a direct request to Windchill to load the data. However, now that ThingView is a native browser application, if you ask it to load data from Windchill, that is considered a cross-site origin request and will be actively denied. In order to get data to load inside of the ThingView widget, you'll need to make sure that you provide data in a couple different ways. One, you certainly have the option to host that data on the ThingWorx server itself, in which case the user's browser session will be loading data from the same server that is serving up the mashup. If that's not an option and you would like to retrieve this dynamically elsewhere, you might consider having the content routed through a proxy service like the one provided in ThingWorx Navigate. For more information on that, you can see the article listed in the slide. This gives you a good example of how to route content through this proxy service in order to provide it to users. Just as a reminder, you cannot simply provide a direct link to Windchill content to load. This violates cross-site request rules. All right, so let's take a quick look at how we've configured that initial product to view, just so that way you can see what it looks like to create a mashup. If I go back to the simple basic mashup that we started with, I can take a look at this content here. This is a relative path to the location that we want to load the content from. If I go into the ThingWorx Composer and look at the basic ThingView mashup, we can see here that what we're populating is that we're pulling the value of this label in this field and putting it into the product to view. So in this case, what's happening is we are simply loading the Weldement PVZ file from the relative path of sample data / Weldement PVZ, which exists right next to the ThingWorx. This URL works because it is going to pull from the same server, the same site, so it does not violate that request. It does not warrant a cross-site request. All right, the next thing you should be aware of are some of the key important settings that are driven through properties of the widget. The first is making the controls, which we started to talk about, available to users. In order to enable users to see the view panel and the model control panel, you'll need to enable them. These are enabled by default for the Navigate apps. The ThingView Controls property controls whether or not these are visible to users. In addition to making them visible, you can fine-tune exactly what kind of content is displayed to the user. We have several different options for that. Display view states will control whether or not view states are displayed to the user. This is enabled by default inside of Navigate. Display section cuts will show any pre-authored section cuts that came from your CAD tool. These are disabled because typically users will want to activate a view state, which may in turn activate a section cut. They likely don't want to just activate a pre-authored section cut. Display alternate reps or display simplet reps for some of our Creo friends is for displaying simplified representations that have been authored into the CreoView data. Again, typical practice is that these simplified representations will get activated through a view state. But if you'd like to expose those directly to the user, you can simply enable the display alternate reps option. Display explode states, similar to alternate reps and section cuts, is another aspect of something controlled by the combine state. You can also display the explode states if you'd like users to be able to activate them separately. Lastly, we have the ability to display playback controls. The playback controls are the animation and sequence controls that allow you to play the animation and navigate through the sequences. You can disable this if you would like to control that externally inside of the mashup. In addition to providing the UI controls, we also have some control over how the user views things. So mouse navigation is an important one because typically your users are very used to interacting with 3D content in a specific way. We have 3 different mouse control navigation models available. CreoView, which will emulate the mouse controls available from CreoView. Creo, which will emulate the mouse controls available from Creo Parametric. And CATIA V5, which emulates the mouse controls available from CATIA V5. You can set these at a mashup level, and that way the users will be using a set of mouse controls that they're typically used to. 2 other important settings are projection mode and perspective. So projection mode will control whether or not you use an orthographic or a perspective view. And perspective field of view allows you to control and either tighten or expand the field of view when set to perspective. This setting isn't relevant when you're using orthographic view. I would encourage you to take a look at several of the other settings and configurations available though. We've got pretty good documentation which outlines what each of the different properties control inside of the ThingView widget. So in addition to being able to tell what to view and control how you want the viewer to behave, There are a couple key data tables which are really important for building powerful mashups inside of Navigate. The first is the views table. The views table contains the viewable content that you would typically see inside of CreoView. So in CreoView, you would see these under the Viewables tab. It uses a views data shape that is packaged with the ThingView extension and is automatically available. And this views data shape and table will allow you to activate any of the viewable content. This means it will allow you to activate view states, annotation sets, figures, explode states, simplified representations, amongst many other items. Selecting any of these rows will activate this view inside of the mashup. You can use this if you would like to externally control what is displayed for the user. Let's say for the case of illustrations and figures, you would like to control exactly what figure the user is seeing rather than let them navigate through all of them. You can use this views table in order to activate those. Let's take a quick look at what that looks like. If I go back to the ThingView views mashup that I had shown earlier, we can see here that all of the views are available in the data table here. The way that this works is we simply have the views that are available in the ThingView widget being loaded into the table to display in the mashup. So this is actually displaying the same content that is in that views data table. Selecting any of these will activate that in the view, so that way the user can do that. But I would not encourage you to have both a data table displaying the views table and the use of the view controls at the same time, because the two can conflict with one another. If we change this now back to the Weldement and demonstrate how you can modify data that's being loaded, we can see here that we've loaded that Weldement data that I started with. Here we see a great demonstration of all the different types of content that might be available. We see that there are different view states available, which are the same that we see here in the view states column. But we also see several other items. There are explode states here. There are also section cuts that are already pre-authored. And there's some simplified representations as well. So this may contain some things that are a little confusing to the user because they do not specify what type they are. And it may be easier for them to interact with them inside of the control panel. So that's it about the views table. So this is the most important thing to understand when trying to control what to load after you loaded the PVZ file. In addition to the views table, an important table to understand is the data table. The data table starts to interact with the actual structure and 3D content inside of the view. We utilize this data table to perform two things. You have the ability to enable cross-selection in order to actually populate and show what's of interest in the model. We also have the ability to influence color highlighting between the 3D model and an external data source. This data table will not be populated by the ThingView application. It will only have rows selected if the ID matches. This is a great table to use if you have a good knowledge of the data that you are displaying and you would like to allow the user to interactively select back and forth between the two of them, or would like to influence the color. If you don't have good knowledge of the internal ID paths of the CreoView data, there's another table that we'll talk about in a moment that's likely better to use. Let's take a look at exactly how that might work. All right, I've got a mashup here called the ThingView data property. If we take a look at how that's constructed, it's pretty simple here. We have a data table that I'm populating with the thing that controls all the part details. And from that, from that data table, ThingView will react to it based on what's been selected and what it's been populated with. When I load the data up here, we can see here that I have 3 different parts that's been populated. And the key is that this table must contain an ID path that ThingView can understand in order to select things. We've now got a color that's been applied, and we can see that that color has been applied to a yellow component, a green component, and a red component, which have all been colored based on the state applied. You can see when I select these and go back and forth, it will automatically select them in the 3D view as well. If I zoom out and select one of the components in the data table, it will cause a selection inside that data table. But as you can see, if I select a component that's not in the data table, it will not add it to that table. That's because the ThingView widget does not add or populate, it only reacts to what is already in this table. It assumes that the data table is controlled by an external source. All right. Let's take a look at the other way that it worked with cross-selection. So the last key data table to be aware of is what we call the selected part table. The selected part table is a data table that contains the occurrence IDs of the selected parts. The data table uses a selection data type that is also provided with ThingView extension. There are also some simple string properties available for the last selected or pre-selected parts. So if you'd rather just be able to see the exact name of what's the occurrence path of the object that's been selected, there are simple string properties available for that as well, but they will only contain a single object in them. This selected part table allows you to react to what the user has been selecting. So this allows you to see and have it automatically populated by ThingView what has been selected by the user. It also goes the other way around. If you would like to select something externally, you can populate something into that table, and ThingView will react to that table being populated and select whatever has been populated. Now, the key here is that you need to understand the occurrence IDs of the selected parts. In ThingWorx 8.5, you are required to understand the internal occurrence ID of those parts in order to pass information back and forth. We've made some improvements in ThingWorx 9, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So that's the major key data tables that you'll need to understand when interacting and building mashups using the 3D viewer. Let's take a look at some of the exciting new updates for ThingWorx 9, including some improvements for that selected parts data table. In ThingWorx 9, we made a couple key improvements. We heard feedback from users that typically they'd like to use the orthographic view as their default view inside of Navigate. This is consistent with Windchill as well as the Creo application suites. So inside of ThingWorx 9, Navigate View Part Structure app will now display objects in the orthographic view mode by default. In addition to updating the view, we've also made some improvements to the lighting to help users transition between Creo View and Navigate a little bit easier. In ThingWorx 9, we made lighting consistent between Creo View and the ThingWorx application. Now it should be largely very difficult to be able to differentiate between viewing things in Creo View and ThingWorx Navigate. You can see here the difference between the lighting in ThingWorx 8.5 and ThingWorx 9, where we've made it the same as Creo View. This is also consistent with changes that have been made in Windchill 12, where they will also enforce the same lighting scheme. In addition to lighting, we've also updated the default model color so that way it matches with the default model color from Creo View. Again, you can sense the theme here that we're really trying to make a seamless user experience between Creo View users and those using ThingWorx Navigate. Inside of ThingWorx 9, we've updated this selected parts data table to take in a selected parts selection mode. This selection mode will take in 3 different possible values. The ID path would be consistent with the older behavior where it requires a full ID path of the object that you would like to select inside of the 3D viewer. However, two new modes are available: property path and property value. Property path and property value allow you to specify an attribute or property inside of the Creo view data that contains the information that you're interested in or that you can uniquely identify the parts with. Typically, this would be something like a part number. If it's set to property path or property value, you can set the selection property group name and selection property name to the property group and property name in the Creo view data that contains the attribute of interest. So in this case, you'll likely have a system property part name or part number that you want to use in order to specify a part number to pass back and forth, since normally you're able to identify what it is you want to select based on its part number. Now, the reason why we don't always use part numbers is because part number is not necessarily a unique thing, and it's not necessarily always available for everyone's data. By doing it this way, we allow you to select the property of interest that you do know or can externally determine in order to select what's present inside the viewer. In order to make these updates, we've also had to update the selection data shape in order to accommodate them. Now the data shape will have three different columns: ID path, property value, and property path. Depending on what you've populated as the mode, the column that it uses in order to do the selection will be changed. In this case, the property value mode will populate the property value column in the info table. It will use the value of the selection property group name and selection property name in order to populate that. In this case, if you wanted to use the Windchill part properties and specify the part number that's present in Windchill, you can specify the group name Windchill part and the property name part number. And this would allow you to take in a part number to enable cross-selection. However, because part number is not necessarily unique, you may want to get a little bit more specific. You may want to select a single instance of that part number based on a path. The property path mode will allow you to do that. In this case, you utilize the same property group name and property name, which we've configured to part number in order to pass in a path with a slash separator. In this case, we can select a particular instance of the part number 204 by specifying the child 201/204. In this case, we'll go from the parent to the subassembly 201, and then from that subassembly 201 to the part 204. However, if there's more than one instance of 204, it will select all instances of 204 inside the 201 subassembly. All right, let's take a quick look at how that looks. So my last mashup I prepared here is this selection property. What we've done is we've created a data table and pre-populated it with the entirety of the structure that we see here inside the 3D view. Now, we did not read this from the Creo view data. We populated this ahead of time in order to demonstrate populating each of these values correctly. That way we can demonstrate the usage of the ID path, property path, or property value to enable selection. Now inside of this, we've gone ahead and started the mashup using the property value. This is the least specific version of this selection mode, meaning it will select anything with that part number regardless of where it is in the structure. Now we can select thing view, and we can scroll down here and we can see what the selected part selection mode has been set to. We see it set to property value, and then I inform the group name and the property name that I would like to use to pass back and forth. Now if I go here and I can see I can select the part number 181, and we will populate 181 into this field. And what happens is when we initially populate the part number 181, then the 3D viewer is selecting anything with the part number 181, and then updating the data table back because it found 2 instances of it. Now, similarly, I can go the other way, and I can select an instance of an object here, and it will populate that into the data table. And now we go the other way with cross selection. So now I'm actually able to react to what is being selected. I can even react to what is being selected and parse that out and do something as simple as display the part number that the user selected. So that here, I can now select anything in the session, and I can display that based on what the user has selected. Now, because the user is selecting an individual instance, it's very easy to pull out a single value. Whereas if I influence and select something externally based on the part number, I may get more than one object selected. In this case, I'll select part number 185, where I see that there's several instances of it. And what we'll notice here is that it will select all instances of the part number 185. Now, let's take a look at what happens when we change that. So if I go here and I change it from property value to property path, now it will be reliant on the property path where I can get a little bit more specific, but still use part numbers in order to select things. I'll go ahead and save the mashup and view that. And now let's see how that changes. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this property path here, and I'm going to select something that may have a slightly more specific part number. So let's use that 185 example again here. So if I select this part number 185, I can select it, and previously we saw that we had at least 8 occurrences selected. Now I know that there's 2 occurrences, but there's only 2 occurrences in this one subassembly. So I can get more specific down to the individual subassembly by being able to pass in the path. Now, if I'd like to get the most specific and get down to an individual occurrence, because part number isn't a unique attribute, I need to go back to using the ID path. I can then go here and switch it to the ID path, save again, view the mashup, and now I can go ahead and select that one occurrence, and it will select the individual that I had selected. With that, we'll go ahead and take a look and answer any questions that have been coming up as we've been going.
Thank you for the very, very good presentation, Robbie. Just for clarification, this recording will be sent to you tomorrow and also published in PTC Community and PTC Support Portal to allow you to share and to review the awesome content we had here. So now let's review some of the questions that were raised so far. And while we are reviewing it, feel free to type another question that you might have. So the first one, does the 3D viewer support displaying annotation sets?
Great question. Yes. So the 3D viewer does support displaying annotation sets that are authored in CreoView. However, they're currently not displayable from the view panel on the left side dropdown. So if you would like to be able to access and display annotation sets that were saved in the CreoView data, you do need to access them from the view info table and activate them that way. So normally you would want to display those or control those in the custom mashup and have a display somewhere that the user can select them. And when you select that from the info table, the 3D viewer will activate that and display it in the 3D view.
Very good. So we have another one here. Does the 3D viewer support all viewable types available from CreoView?
Also a good question. So at the moment, the 3D viewer supports, as of ThingWorx 9, supports the 3D content views that are available from CreoView. So what that means is it will support any data that was published from CAD, and you can interact with that, as well as any illustration content that came from Creo Illustrate. We do not support drawings, documents, or schematic or PCB views on the ECAD side. We do have plans to make some of those available in the future, and we should see the first that we will be making available is document views, So you should be able to view PDFs inside of the viewer as well, and that should be likely coming in an upcoming ThingWorx release. But at the moment, as of ThingWorx 9, we only support the 3D views coming from CAD or illustrations.
That's great, Robbie. Now I have a question for myself. How do customers are able to track improvements and roadmap changes on Navigate 3D Viewer and Navigate overall?
Yeah, that's great. So, typically we've done a pretty good job including the updates in the what's new sections of the documentation and keeping that up to speed so that way you can see any improvements or changes that we've made to the 3D viewer. So that's probably the best place to keep in track of roadmap updates, as well as attending sessions like these and getting updates on the new content that's come out.
That's all right. And we have a new one here. Does PDC have plans to integrate Windchill content viewing directly from 3D Viewer, not having to go through proxy or eHost, etc.?
So the problem with that is not an integration problem. It's how it's actually how you're allowed to route content through web applications in general. So web applications in general, if you host an application from one website and request content from another, it's considered a cross-origin request, and that has to be authorized and explicitly configured. We are looking at potentially documenting how to do that. However, it's a pretty extensive configuration on both the Windchill and the Navigate side in order to do that. Because you have to authorize those requests back and forth, whereas we believe that especially for an out-of-the-box configured system, the content proxy makes a much simpler mechanism to ensure that the content is coming from the same server that the user is accessing.
Excellent. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much, Robbie. I don't think we have any more questions. So once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. The recording of this session will be made available to you soon, as well as a survey where I'll be able to provide your feedback and propose topics for the next session. Thank you and have a great weekend.